Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with chicken fricassee. That's right, after a decade of requests, I'm finally getting around to doing this classic dish. And if you're my age, the first time you heard about fricasseing something was probably on Bugs Bunny. And yes, in an homage, I was going to use rabbit for this. But then I remember not many people cook rabbit, and the ones that do are used to adapting recipes for chicken to cook their little furry former friends. So I went with chicken, and I thought this really did come out incredibly well. So with that, let's go ahead and get started by seasoning some skin-on, bone-in chicken thighs. And we'll do that by generously applying some kosher salt to both sides. And yes, you can use boneless, skinless thighs for this, or boneless, skinless chicken breasts. But please don't. It won't be as good. Oh, and if there's an actual live human at the store when you're buying your chicken thighs, have the person behind the counter pick out 6 that are the same size, so they cook nice and evenly. But anyway, once those are seasoned, we'll go ahead and place those skin side down in a skillet set over medium-high heat, in which we placed about a tablespoon of vegetable oil. And yes, of course we want to let that oil get hot before we place the chicken in. Okay, if that skin doesn't sizzle when it hits the pan, it's not hot enough. Take it out and let it heat for another minute. And we really want to take our time here and get a beautiful sear on that surface, not only so it looks better, but also so we can render out that thin layer of fat below the skin, which is going to give it a better texture later, and it won't be what we call in the business, flabby. And if you need another reason, that flavorful rendered chicken fat is going to be perfect for doing the next step, which as you'll see is browning some mushrooms. But anyway, first things first, and once that skin side is nicely seared, and we flip those over, we will give that other side a couple minutes as well, at which point we'll turn off the heat and remove those to a plate, which we will just set aside until we need it. And then before we do add our mushrooms, we will take a little inventory regarding the amount of fat, since we want about 2 or 3 tablespoons. And if we have more than that, we can always spoon a few tablespoons out and use that for something else, like some incredible home fries or a next level grilled cheese. And that's it. Once we're happy with the amount of fat, we can dump in our thickly sliced mushrooms, and we'll set our heat back to medium-high and toss in a nice big pinch of salt, and then we'll cook these stirring until very nicely browned. And if you've been watching for a while, you know how this goes. All right, first we make them wet, then we make them dry, then we make them wet. And what that means is the salt's going to draw out liquid from the mushrooms, and the mushrooms will basically start boiling in their own juices. But eventually that evaporates away, and since fat doesn't evaporate, the mushrooms will start frying, and before you know it, they will be beautifully browned, and hopefully looking something like this. Okay, so we made them wet, and then we made them dry, which means we can now move on with the rest of the ingredients, and then eventually make these wet by adding our cooking liquids. But for now, what we'll do is toss in some sliced shallots, as well as some minced garlic, and some diced onion. And we'll stir all this together and cook it for a few minutes until our onions start to soften and turn translucent. And while we're doing that, in between stirs, we can go ahead and toss in some freshly ground black pepper. Plus, if we want, and we almost always do, we can add a few shakes of cayenne. And yes, if you feel like switching stirring utensils, go ahead. Okay, I decided this flat wooden spatula would be better at this job than that more flexible spoonula. And if you ever feel like you need to make that kind of change, go ahead. I mean, you are, after all, the Bugs Bunny of your fricassee. And then once we feel like our shallots, garlic, and onions have cooked long enough, which, by the way, can just be onions and garlic. But anyway, once those are set, we'll go ahead and sprinkle in just a little bit of flour, and we will stir that in and cook it for about a minute to help give our sauce a little bit of body later. And then once that flour has cooked for about a minute or two, we can start adding our cooking liquids, starting with the most important, and that would be some nice drinkable white wine. And I use about twice as much as your average fricassee recipe, since I think most versions don't call for enough, and you don't get as much flavor and acidity as I think we need. So I'm going with 1.5 cups. Oh, and if you're keeping score at home, that wine was a Sauvignon Blanc. And what we'll do is stir that in, and then raise our heat to high, since we want this wine to reduce by about half. And because we did add that little bit of flour, as this reduces, you'll see things thicken up a little bit. So we'll cook this on high for a few minutes. And then once that wine has reduced by about half, and no, this is not some kind of precise measurement, just reduce it down until it looks a little bit like this, at which point we can dump in our chicken broth, homemade or prepared. And as usual, if times are tough, you can just use water with maybe a spoon of chicken base. And then while we wait for this to come back to a simmer, we can toss in some freshly picked thyme leaves, as well as 1 dried bay leaf, which you can just add at the same time. All right, I was spacing out. And that's it. Once those last couple ingredients are stirred in and everything's come back to a boil on high heat, we'll go ahead and reduce our heat down somewhere between medium-low and low. And we can add our chicken back in, skin side up. And please do not, under any circumstances, forget to add those accumulated juices on the plate back in. Okay, we paid for those juices, and darn it, we're going to use them. Plus, they add flavor, so never discard those. And that's it. We'll go ahead and cover this tightly, and we will let it simmer gently for about 45 minutes. And about halfway through, if we can remember, I think we should uncover and go ahead and turn these over. And besides just giving them a flip, if we wanted to move them around a little so that those are in different positions in the pan, okay, you can do that as well. And whether that does anything or not, who knows? But if I've said it once, I've said it 100 times. It is fun to play with your food, especially when it's still in the pan. But anyway, we'll go ahead and flip and or move, and we'll pop that lid back on. And like I said, we'll continue cooking that covered for a total of about 45 minutes. And at that point, we can go ahead and uncover, and we can flip those back over to the original skin side up position. And we will complete the rest of the cooking process without the lid on, so that while our chicken finishes cooking, our sauce is reducing and thickening, which are basically the 2 things we're looking for before we move into final production. And I do like to baste the meat while it finishes cooking, which again, I'm not sure how much of a practical effect that has, but man, it just feels right and is surprisingly therapeutic. Oh yeah, if you're feeling stressed, spoon some hot liquid over a simmering chicken thigh. That'll fix you up. And that's it. Besides the occasional basting, we're just waiting for our sauce to reduce down a little more and for our chicken to finish getting nice and tender. And of course, the sauce thing we can just do by eye, but you can't really see if something's tender. So we'll want to check with the tip of a knife or a fork. And while we don't want these falling apart, that blade should slide in pretty easily, which mine did. And once that happens, we'll go ahead and finish this dish up with a nice splash of heavy cream. Or for extra credit, an equal amount of creme fraiche, which is simply a fermented heavy cream, which has a little more flavor and acidity. And I would have used that, but I had a ton of cream in the fridge, so that's what I'm stirring in. And then once that cream's been incorporated, and we've spooned those now much creamier cooking liquids over our chicken, like nobody's watching, we can raise our heat up a little bit to medium, and cook this until we're very happy with everything. And I'd love to tell you how long that's going to take, but I can't. Depends on many things, but mostly how thick you want your sauce. All right, by now our chicken should be nicely tender, and we could serve this any time, but maybe you want to reduce your sauce down till it's very thick. Or maybe, like me, you just want it to reduce a little more, so it's just barely thick enough to coat a spoon. But in any case, before you serve this, make sure you give the sauce a taste, just to see if it needs another pinch of salt, or maybe an extra shake of cayenne. And that's it. Once we get to where we want it to go, we'll go ahead and serve that up. And as far as presentation goes, we'll probably want to do one last basting of the top, plus maybe one more scattering of fresh thyme, so everything looks nice and fresh for our guests, and or our contractually obligated pictures. And this was looking and smelling so good, I could not resist grabbing a fork and knife and taking a couple bites right out of the pan. And no, you should not be cutting with a knife down to the bottom of one of these nice pans. But you know what? I was starving, and my wife was in the other room, so I went for it. And I'm so glad I did, because that, my friends, really was extraordinary. Okay, such a simple, comforting dish. But simple does not mean not complex, although I guess technically it does. But what I'm trying to say is the flavor profile is not one note. All right, there is a lot going on here, and all of it is good. So I went ahead and plated one up properly, and spooned over plenty of that amazing mushroomy, creamy sauce, and finished up with one last pinch of thyme, at which point I grabbed a fork and knife and dug in. And I started in the back with a nice piece of skin, which is one of my favorite parts of this. And no, it's not crispy, but as I mentioned, that fat has been rendered out, so it doesn't have that chewy, flabby texture, and it is very, very flavorful, as is pretty much everything else, including those mushrooms, which if you brown them properly, should be every bit as savory as the meat. But anyway, that's it. My take on classic chicken fricassee. Yes, there were a lot of little steps during the cooking process, but they were all very easy. And there's absolutely no reason, even a novice cook, can't produce something as good or even better than what I did. And like I said earlier, this will also work with rabbit. But either way, whether you use a wascally rabbit or chicken, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.